This is my nerd world. I'm glad you're here. You're invited. A Star Wars podcast. Good thing we have Star Wars to talk about, by the way, because what else do we talk about? There's nothing else going on in the world right now. All right, on the episode this week, we're going to talk Mandalorian Season 2, Episode 2, Chapter 10, The Passenger. Man, the Mandalorian season is good. This is really good. I mean, I like the first season, but these first two episodes, they've been a lot of fun. All right, so we're going to talk about that. There's a fantastic article from The Ringer and Bill Simmons' network. He does a Rewatchables podcast, which I listen to every week, and you should too, because it's awesome. They talk about The Mandalorian and whether or not, what if it's just, what if The Mandalorian were just a procedural? And this is coming from a less than casual fan that wrote this. Interesting observation about why so many individuals in the fandom love Rogue One, and how I am starting to wonder whether or not people actually care that much about the Jedi. So we'll get into that and your listener feedback this week. I'm glad you're with the show. Be sure to go to mynerdworld.net for all things related to the My Nerd World podcast and the EMBARK science fiction space opera series, available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. As always, more details on that at the end of the show.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My Nerd World.
Just let it in.
I'm so happy I have this podcast. Can I just tell you that? I really am. It gives me such a nice break from everything else going on in the world. I am Jon Justice. This is the My Nerd World of Star Wars podcast, and I'm glad you're with the show. You can always email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Be sure to head on over to mynerdworld.net. I'm going to be giving away autographed copies, signed copies of all three of the first books in the EMBARK series every single week. So if you're not signed up for the newsletter, you can do that by going to the website and getting signed up. Everybody who signs up for the newsletter is automatically placed into a drawing for a signed copy of one of the EMBARK books, and we'll do some grand prize drawings as well for the entire trilogy. So got a number of things to get to. A lot of it centered around The Mandalorian. Before we dive into that, just a couple of quick observations of some Star Wars related things that have happened this week. I'm a big J.J. Abrams fan. I've mentioned this before. When J.J. Abrams was announced to do Star Wars, I was super excited. He's just one of those directors that makes movies that I find rewatchable in every sense of the way. In every sense of the term. Super 8, Mission Impossible 3, the 2009 or 10, I think it came out in 2009, Star Trek, and Star Trek Into Darkness. I just, of course, in the Star Wars films as well. J.J. Abrams has a flair for directing his films and the writing that goes into them, where they're just incredibly entertaining, in my opinion. It's probably one of the reasons why I am such a huge fan of The Rise of Skywalker. I loved The Force Awakens, but I also feel like with The Force Awakens, that's a really unique film. It's distinctly J.J. Abrams, but also J.J. Abrams really trying to make sure that he adheres to that Star Wars aesthetic that kicked off the whole series in A New Hope. Something similar can be said, I think, about The Mandalorian as well, especially season 1 of The Mandalorian. It's paced very much like that first Star Wars movie. The Force Awakens did exactly what it was supposed to do, but it also wasn't J.J. Abrams going full J.J. Abrams. The Rise of Skywalker, in my opinion, was J.J. Abrams going full J.J. Abrams. And again, it's probably one of the reasons why I love that movie so much and why it's currently one of my favorites. It's has a lot to do with the story and what plays out in the story and being the final chapter in the Skywalker saga, but it also is so distinctly J.J. Abrams and Star Wars, so it really does combine two things that I love. I was watching Star Trek Into Darkness, and that's kind of what set me down this path. I was actually watching it not too long before I started the show this morning. And it's interesting because that film really has a lot in common with The Rise of Skywalker. Not so much in the storytelling aspect of it, but there's just certain scenes, like when they go to Kronos and they encounter the Klingons and the lighting and the lightning. I immediately thought of Exegol in the Rise of Skywalker, and I just thought it was really interesting. I hope that J.J. Abrams does more sci-fi, because I just think he does sci-fi really, really well. And I love those films. I love the Star Trek movies. And J.J. Abrams had been very open about that first. I'm sorry, the Star Trek movies. J.J. Abrams had been very open about that first Star Trek film, that it was essentially he wanted to do Star Trek like Star Wars because he always wanted to do a Star Wars movie. And both of those films are essentially Star Wars movies. If you were to go and just change the ships and change the characters and put it in the Star Wars universe, you could tell both of those stories easily within the Star Wars universe. And I don't care. I'm here for it. I love them. I love them both. And so it just, and I like them more than the older Star Trek films. I really like Wrath of Khan. I think that's a fantastic Star Trek movie, but I was never a massive fan of those films, mostly from a production standpoint. The production on those movies being so old just doesn't hold up. Wrath of Khan does. Voyage Home kind of does, but I prefer the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films. So just wanted to toss that out there. If you want some further commentary about Star Trek and Into Darkness, be sure to check out the episode that I did on a space opera podcast where I focused on Into Darkness. And there'll be more space opera podcasts coming up very soon. I've just been so busy with the EMBARK novels that I've taken a break from that podcast, just sticking with the Star Wars podcast. Another quick thought, and then we'll dive into The Mandalorian. Listening to, I believe it was either Talking Bay 94 or it was Around the Galaxy. Anyway, they were doing an interview with an artist who had worked and does work with Star Wars and has for decades. And during the course of the interview, this artist mentioned how Rogue One was his favorite Star Wars movie next to some of the originals, and I hear that from a lot of people, right? You know, Rogue One gets a lot of universal praise, a lot in the same way that The Mandalorian does, and it got me thinking. And I'm going to appeal to you on this. I'd like to know what you think. So email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, and let me know your thoughts on this. But I can't help but wonder if the Jedi Knight aspect of Star Wars isn't really all that important to the fandom. I think we're going to find out with this High Republic endeavor that that Disney and Lucasfilm are doing, or LucasArts. I guess there's not a movie with that yet, but I'm wondering how much the fandom really cares about the larger lore when it comes to the Jedi. So, for example, in the original trilogy, you had Luke training to be a Jedi, and we had the tales of Jedi Knights from long before, right? And of course, in the prequels, then you get to see all the Jedi Knights. Watched Attack of the Clones this week. And I love that film. You know, I know it's most people's least favorite Star Wars movie, but I love that film, and especially love the end of that movie on Geonosis. Everything from the Jedi battle taking place inside the arena to when the Republic gunships show up. I mean, it's just one of the best finales to a Star Wars film ever. It's one of my favorites next to the end of the Rise of Skywalker. The end of that film, the last 45 minutes of Attack of the Clones is just so much fun, right up until the wedding at the end. Spoiler alert. But again, watching that and then hearing some of the commentary from individuals, especially around Mandalorian and how much everybody loves the Mandalorian, especially around Rogue One. These are pieces of Star Wars content that feature the Force, right? But the Jedi aren't prominent in any of these. And they weren't really in the original trilogy. You had Luke training to be a Jedi, like I said. You had the historical context there, but you didn't really have anything to go off of other than just what was being spoken in the dialogue of those films. It reminds me a little bit of The Matrix. There's a lot of parallels between the first Matrix movie and then Reloaded and Revolutions that I really love. You can actually also make a comparison to a certain, maybe a lesser extent, and I probably shouldn't even mention it, but there's kind of a similar thing that happened with the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, right? That original Pirates of the Caribbean movie, that original Matrix movie, everybody really, really loved for what they were, and they were simpler in plot and design than their second and third parts, which people weren't as big a fan of. But with The Matrix, you had Neo, the singular hero, going on his journey and arc, and then when you get into that second film, they just flip the switch and they open up the whole universe. So now it's not this smaller story of a group of individuals outside the Matrix fighting inside the Matrix. Now we actually go to Zion and we see all these people and we see multiple ships, right? It gets a lot bigger, and I think for a lot of people, they're not huge fans of that. The prequels have always taken a lot of criticism. They've received a lot of love, thankfully, over the course of, say, the past 10 years, and they've aged a lot better, and I believe that the sequel trilogy will as well. People still complain about the prequels, don't misunderstand, but I think a lot of people are revisiting them and really appreciating them for what they do and what they are. But I just also wonder, again, how much people actually cared about the Republic and about the Jedi Knights serving in power. You know, it is a broader story, and there's arguments to be made that the smaller, simpler stories are better and more compelling. And the fact that people constantly talk about Rogue One being their favorite and how much everybody loves The Mandalorian, I'm very interested to see what Disney does with the lore and the content moving forward as it relates to the pre-Phantom Menace Jedi. And I can't help but wonder if this High Republic endeavor that they are, the High Council, right? High Republic. This High Republic endeavor that they're embarking on with these books, potentially video games and comics, if this isn't a bit of a trial balloon to see if the fandom ends up gravitating towards it, if they really do want this. I had to dig a little deep within my own fandom to kind of question myself how much I cared about that. Because I do love the prequels, but I don't know. When it comes to the full council and the Jedi, yeah, it's cool. I dig it. But it's not my favorite aspect of Star Wars by any stretch. I prefer those smaller stories of an individual learning the Jedi ways, and certainly the way that it's handled within the context of the sequel trilogy. So I wonder what you think, or am I just basically talking about segments of the fandom again? Is there just a portion of the fandom that looks at that original trilogy as being sort of the gospel of Star Wars, and so they'd like everything that comes out of new Star Wars content to be more reflective of the original trilogy and less on this grander sort of scope of grandeur and councils and the Republic when it's at its height? They'd rather see this gritty, lived-in universe where Jedi exist, but they're not the focal point. The Force is there, but it's not necessarily driving the story forward. I'd like to know what you think. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. That's the email address. What do you think? Do you think the overall fandom cares that much about the broader stories of the Jedi Knights? Do you think that the High Republic is basically sort of a trial for Disney to find out how much the fans are going to want to see this type of storytelling? In which case, that may dictate what they do moving forward. I don't have a definitive answer on my end about what I'd like to see. I mean, I gravitate more towards a combo of the two. I would like to see sort of Jedi enter into the mix on The Mandalorian, and I think we eventually will when Ahsoka arrives on the scene, even though she is no Jedi. But I'm curious what you think, because I just find it really interesting that so many people love Rogue One, and yet Rogue One is actually missing a big component of what makes Star Wars Star Wars, and that is the and that is the Jedi Knights. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. Like to know what you think.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
All right, so I'm going to save you from doing a scene-by-scene, shot-by-shot breakdown of Mandalorian Chapter 10, The Passenger. I'm just going to kind of give you my instinctive reaction and my thoughts having watched the episode twice now. I'm really enjoying these first 2 episodes of The Mandalorian. And these first 2 episodes of Season 2 of The Mandalorian have me wanting to rewatch them more so than the first 2 episodes of Season 1 of The Mandalorian. I put up a rather lengthy, spoiler-free post on my nerd blog at mynerdworld.net that you can go and read. And in that, I broke down how in Season 1, I really do feel like Jon Favreau, the directors, the artists who are filming this, who are in charge of the special effects, they were all sort of wrapping their heads around how they can utilize the volume, this means of having a single stage covered by video screens where they can shoot a majority of the stuff in camera. And Season 1 seems reflective of that. Follows a pattern of most new series where it takes a couple of episodes for it to get going. Those final episodes of Season 1 I just love, and especially the last episode directed by Taika Waititi, which has me so excited for whatever his Star Wars film is going to be in 2023 or 22 or whatever. It seems like with these first 2 episodes of Season 2, though, they have really figured out how to use this technology in the storytelling. And both of these episodes they're just a ton of fun. The Passenger isn't a filler episode, and we're going to get into this when it comes into listener feedback. Somebody made a point about, the difference between filler episodes and then, episodes that go and advance the plot. And I tend to agree with them. But I do think some people look at these sort of singular stories that we get as more of filler episodes, even though they do lend themselves to the larger story. And in this case, the Mandalorian having to go and find other Mandalorians and then utilizing individuals to help him on his way. This episode, though, I just thought was a ton of fun. From the opening sequence of the bounty hunters attempting to take him out, picking up right after Chapter 9 did, the moment where the alien tries to take the child, and Mando attempts to bargain with them with his jetpack, and he does his little move and sends him up into the sky, and then he comes crashing back to the ground, and he lands the jetpack. Just really cool, just a really cool, fun scene. It should be noted, too, that Peyton Reed was the director of Chapter 10, and he's most notable for directing Ant-Man and the Wasp and the Ant-Man, which makes a lot of sense because there's quite a bit of subtle humor within this episode that I really enjoyed. He also directed Bring It On, which is kind of a guilty favorite of mine and my wife's as well. Maybe I'm just saying my wife so that I don't sound like a weirdo, but Bring It On's a fun movie. This was a great episode, though. I love when he gets back to Tatooine and he has the exchange again in the middle of when, and I keep forgetting her name, but when the mechanic there with the poofy hair is playing Sabak with the insect creature. And again, I don't know the name. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'm a Star Wars fan. Maybe I'm not. There was just a lot of fun aspects to this particular episode. The Passenger in and of himself, I remember seeing a photo about a week ago from the trailer where somebody had screen captured the Mandalorian inside an ice cave from one of the trailers, and it showed this weird-looking lizard creature, and everybody was kind of scratching their head going, well, that looks really odd. It looks like something out of Star Trek, not Star Wars. But that creature actually, that female creature with the eggs actually worked really, really well. Looks a lot like my new puppy, Artemis, by the way. My family didn't think so, but I thought so. The whole sequence with the TIE fighters. By the way, that was Dave Filoni, the director of many of these episodes, again, as one of the TIE fighter pilots. The whole sequence with the TIE fighters, with the X-Wing fighters, was just spectacular. That was a lot of fun. I love my vehicles. I've made no secret of that on the show. I absolutely do love the vehicles, and that that chase down to the planet and the crash and the falling through the ice was just that was a blast. Really, really well designed. The moves of the Razor Crest and the Mandalorian throwing the ship around the way that he did was just the stuff of my fanboy dreams. So I loved every moment of that. And then once we get onto the planet, we turn this into almost like a Rebels episode. There's some creatures in there. The spider creatures were taken from Rebels. It had sort of that monster movie feel to it, but it was a lot of fun. The child within the episode I thought was utilized really well. Again, I really found myself connected to the passenger, the plot point of her leaving to go into this warm pond inside these ice caves, and the whole running theme of the child eating the eggs and eating the creature and then having to battle these giant, spider creatures, to the finale with the X-Wing pilot showing back up, hearkening back to, along with the way that the passenger was able to connect with the droid that he killed in the prisoner episode from season 1, but the exchange with the X-Wing pilots and them saving his butt, and then when they flew out of the ice cave, it was all great. It was just another really fun episode, advancing the plot forward while doing its own separate story. Feels very much like Star Wars, but then also feels very, very fresh and new. I think the pacing in these first 2 episodes is better than the majority of season 1, and we're all kind of, I think, realizing what this show is. It's more pulpy. It really is kind of what George Lucas set out to do with the movie, but they did it in a TV show. It's almost as if The Mandalorian is what George would have done if he had decided to make a TV show but couldn't because of the budget constraints. But George initially designed Star Wars after those Flash Gordon Saturday morning black and white serials that he grew up watching. And now, all these decades later, we have this live-action TV show that is very much like the original Star Wars and the original trilogy, and yet we're getting them in singular episodes. So it really is sort of coming full circle to what I think George Lucas had always intended, because these episodes have a Saturday morning feel to them. There's a larger story going on, and I believe they're gonna open up the storytelling to a broader universe, especially if they're going to be bringing in Ahsoka. There's some news going around this week that they're going to be filming a Boba Fett spinoff that is supposed to film prior to season 3. Which would be interesting, especially with the return of Tamira Morrison and Boba Fett in the Chapter 9 episode. But this is just a fun show. It's not Game of Thrones in terms of there's not a lot to dissect and discuss, and it's not designed to do that. I will continue to beat the drum of mythology and how when we get back to the saga films or other live-action Star Wars content, that we are going to need to have some more mythology and stuff to chew on, which kind of dovetails nicely back into the original the original topic or comments that I had at the start of the show about the larger, broader stories of the Jedi Knights and the High Republic content stuff. But that's where, I think Star Wars content really thrives, especially in more of the hardcore fandom and less of the casual fandom. The Mandalorian is doing something really unique and appealing to both, but it's still not giving the hardcore fandom anything to really kind of gnaw on. And that's okay right now. There's time for that. But we're going to need that at some point. I mean, I'm a person that listens to a lot of Star Wars podcasts, and I can tell you that when it comes to the discussions surrounding The Mandalorian, they're pretty basic. That was a fun episode. I really liked this. This connected to that. That worked really well. All of that is okay, but we're not getting into the nitty-gritty and the nuances of the storytelling and where it can go, and I think eventually the fandom's definitely going to need that. And as I keep saying, I think that's where the saga films are going to come into play. All right, let's go here. I have this article here from The Ringer, as I mentioned earlier. What if The Mandalorian were just a procedural? Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni have promised to expand the story into the larger Star Wars universe, but do they really need to? Now, let me say something up front. No other series, except for maybe Marvel, but no other series, gets this much scrutiny. This article was written by a self-proclaimed sort of less than casual fan of the series. And as such, there's a couple of points in here that they missed. There's one big glaring omission in here that this individual missed, which had me kind of scratching my head until I got further into the article and I realized, they're not that big of a fan. They didn't realize what happened. So I edited this down for the sake of the podcast. So here's the gist of it. Disney Plus and The Mandalorian's premiere would mark a momentous occasion. The series creator, writer, occasional director, and showrunner Jon Favreau went above and beyond with the reveal kept tightly under wraps on the advice of young Lando Donald Glover, Baby Yoda, the ultra-cute creature, technically known as the Child, but instantly embraced by the internet under a more straightforward name, even though it's wrong. Few outside the Disney headquarters knew he existed before the episode went live. Hours later, the whole world did. Memes, novelty songs, and general mania ensued. The second season of The Mandalorian kicked off last Friday with an hour that contained no such surprises. Okay, and that's where they got tripped up. Because, yes, the Boba Fett was at the end of that episode. It was akin to, if not even sort of bigger within the larger Star Wars context, than the Child was. I mean, the Child was a brand new character, was not Baby Yoda. Boba Fett is incredibly well known. So, from a technical sort of but actually standpoint, I'd say that the Boba Fett reveal was bigger than the Child reveal, even though the Child reveal, I think, was more impactful. This article certainly shows as an example of that. Let's see. Chapter 9 is comforting in its familiarity. After the first season finale that delivered a volume's worth of character development in itself, this latest outing was a return to form. This isn't quite what we were promised, though, right? Because it talks about how the Mandalorian embarking on outings that would normally advance a larger plot. In practice, it turns out to be a standalone adventure that doesn't much affect a larger story. But again, that's not necessarily true because they missed the Boba Fett aspect of it, and that's a big deal. Anyway, Favreau and primary collaborator Dave Filoni spent much of the season's advance press hyping more scope, a larger story, a less isolated plot lines. To reflect the Mandalorian's newly prominent place in the Star Wars universe, no longer playing second fiddle to the main trilogy, and effectively replacing one for the entertainment-at-home era, the show would meet the moment and expand its horizons. That could include flesh-and-blood versions of characters like Ahsoka Tano and Bo-Katan, or more spectacular showpieces, or other tie-ins to the vast expanded universe of Star Wars lore. Mostly it would mean acknowledging that Star Wars TV show is no longer synonymous with a trifling bit of ephemera, not in the streaming era, and certainly not under Disney management. Full disclosure, I'm not a fan especially knowledgeable about, let alone invested in Star Wars as comprehensive mythology. So there's your answer as to why he didn't pick up on the larger point of Boba Fett being at the end of that episode, him getting the armor, and how big that was to advancing the story of the Mandalorian. It essentially did the same thing that Season 1 did. I can honestly say I was somewhat relieved when the Season 2 premiere for The Mandalorian stuck to the small scale. Chapter 9 feels less like a premiere than a mid-season episode of a show that's comfortably settled into its rhythm, right? That frees Favreau to use Baby Yoda as more of a 3D reaction GIF than an actual plot device. And again, he's mostly practical. The floating green infant doesn't even use the Force in Chapter 9 to affect the main action. He's mostly just there for brief cutaways that serve as mood lightening moments, climbing in and out of baskets on his quest to achieve peak adorability. Nor does the primary story feel that much more weighty. As a work of special effects, a category in which The Mandalorian took home the Emmy in its off-season, the crate dragon is stunning, but the plot it's inserted into, as other critics have pointed out, is a standard-issue Western trope. Throw in a massive medieval monster, and you've got a mashup of Western and high fantasy, the old Star Wars myth blender, back at it with a vengeance. None of this is a criticism, the article writer says. In fact, it's a compliment. The Mandalorian is predictable, accessible on a week-to-week basis, usually self-contained. In other words, it has all the elements of a procedural from a format out of step with its serialized sprawl of streaming as it is with the interconnected offshoots of an IP omnibus like Star Wars. Going forward, The Mandalorian's challenge will be balancing its endearingly low stakes with its increasingly importance to the Star Wars master plan. Chapter 9 is basically a chance for Timothy Olyphant to do his Raylan Givens thing, and that's all it needs to be, especially now that the Mando feels fleshed out enough as a character to carry on in his own show. Favreau and Filoni have positioned the Mandalorian's increased ambitions as a plus, a draw for fans who may have a sweeping epic withdrawal after the disappointment of The Rise of Skywalker, yet The Mandalorian is mostly fun because it's less ambitious than the full-on battle for the soul of the universe. The show is certainly primed to shift gears, but so far it's proven it still works on its own. And again, I find it interesting coming from the standpoint of an individual who is not that big of a Star Wars fan and missed some larger plot points. But it does really speak to the appeal of The Mandalorian and how it's doing a very good job of reaching the casual fans out there, keeping Star Wars alive, bringing all the fandom together, while at the same time also serving the fandom. But Disney's only going to be able to do this for so long. For Star Wars to grow, for Star Wars to continue to be what it is, I firmly believe that they're going to have to bring in these larger mythological angles to it and broader, deeper storytelling than what we're getting inside The Mandalorian. Again, for me, that, just like the article said, that's not a complaint. It's just my opinion of what makes Star Wars great. The fandom talking about it and dissecting it and discussing it. Going back to the Rogue One scenario, Rogue One is a great movie. It's not my favorite of the new Star Wars era films for exactly all the reasons that I talked about. There really isn't much to sort of break down and get into and to chew on inside of Rogue One. It's a self-contained 2-hour-plus film that's a hell of a lot of fun. All the characters die at the end, spoiler alert. But it doesn't really advance anything when it comes to the mythology. The Last Jedi did that. The Rise of Skywalker did that, whether you like it or not. Some of the entries into, some of the added elements that went into both those films did a lot to expand the lore. These forced connection Skype meetings that Reylo were having, the dyad within The Rise of Skywalker, I love. It reminds me a lot of the original trilogy and how in the original trilogy every episode brought another layer to what was happening within the mythology, a new power, something else with the Force that we weren't aware of anymore. I really think that J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson were really smart, and Chris Terrio were really smart to do the very same things that they were doing in the original trilogy. It's unfortunate that a lot of people don't see that because they got locked up in their own headcanon of stuff they wanted to see, but that's okay. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. The Mandalorian is serving its purpose right now very, very well. It is a lot of fun. And it's very Star Wars. And it definitely feeds my need to have more Star Wars content. But we're spoiled now, too, right? Because for so many of us, for years on end, we didn't get new Star Wars. And now we are getting new Star Wars every single year. And not just new Star Wars. I mean, we're getting hours of new Star Wars content. The Mandalorian's airing every single week, for the next month or so. And we're still poised to get another, 7 episodes. That's a lot of Star Wars, even if we don't have any movies right now. And we know that other stuff is being filmed. I'm excited for what Disney's going to do. I think they really have something special with this volume special effects stage that they can use, which is going to really open up the opportunity for more storytelling, different storytelling in different eras at a relatively smaller scale in terms of the production, while still looking absolutely like a movie. I'd love to see these first 2 episodes of The Mandalorian on a big screen just to see how they would hold up. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. That's the email address. I would love to know what you thought of Chapter 10, The Passenger. Email me and we'll talk about it on next week's show.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
I have your emails, and now I'm going to read them and respond to them. The first one comes from friend of the show, Miranda, who says this: I have a strong feeling that as we are moving forward with the show, I can foresee the fandom, or at least many of the subgroups within the fandom, during the time of The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker release, and others that haven't had one kind word to say to the Disney era of Star Wars in general, even before either of those 2 films were out. I get the feeling that a lot of these fans in this community are going to find themselves reconnecting with Star Wars in a way that they couldn't be comfortable with when the sequel trilogy was around. And there was definitely some of that embraced in this trilogy up until one movie in recent times. That being said, I think it's appropriate to say The Mandalorian has become a godsend for the fandom on all fronts, from those that embrace everything in the Star Wars universe or accept everything that has happened in the course of the 9 films and several TV shows and books, see them for what they are, and to those who have made incredibly strong opinions for the world to hear during the prequel and sequel trilogy eras, both in which had the fandom on all fronts engage in intense debates, as we have seen. So, if there's at least one thing out there that could help bring the fandom together, but also help them reconnect and possibly one day give the sequel trilogy a fair shot for those that have been very hard on it, The Mandalorian could be it. I'll even go so far as to say that whatever could become of this up-and-coming Obi-Wan series in the years to come, I could see it having glowing praises because of its character that is so deeply loved, and Ewan McGregor's performance as Obi-Wan during the prequels have been one of the biggest highlights from that, because he gave something to that character that has made the great and late Sir Alec Guinness extremely proud after his own contributions to that same character when he was in the original trilogy. Who knows, maybe I'm too hopeful and spend too much time theorizing. No, I tend to agree. You know, we're going to be dealing with this for a long time. And if Disney and Lucasfilm ever decide to make an episode 10, which I believe that they will, I believe it's going to be very much disconnected from the Skywalker story. Well, you know what? At this point in time, I think we're on pretty good footing. It's almost as if we had to get through. Disney and Lucasfilm had a choice to make when they bought Star Wars. Do we make another 3 movies tied to the Skywalker saga, or we just start producing new content? I would love to be a fly on the wall for some of those conversations, by the way. And I think there's an argument to be made that perhaps they didn't need to make the sequel trilogy, right? I think there's a lot of people that probably agree with me. I'm certainly glad that they did. But they did it, and I think those 3 films are fantastic. They're a ton of fun. They're really great Star Wars movies, in my opinion. But we have these characters now that can still be utilized. And I hope that they utilize them, because I think we can make an episode 10 and jump forward in the timeline a bit with Rey in the future and the story that she's telling, and then make new Star Wars that goes further in the timeline but no longer has the baggage that the sequel trilogy had because of those original trilogy characters. Thank you, Miranda, as always. All right, friend of the show, Edwin, says this from the Lowdown Show. I guess you called it in the trailer. That was Boba Fett's armor on the speeder bike. Do you think Boba will help the Mando find the Jedi? Boba has encountered them before. Anyways, I'm excited to have more Star Wars content to talk about. Yeah, I honestly don't know. There's certainly an argument to be made, but, the Mandalorian right now is kind of searching for the coven of individuals from Navarro that had to leave in the episode when he rescued the child after he turned him in. So, I don't know what the role of Boba Fett's going to be at this point in time. So we'll just have to wait and find out. I'm kind of hesitant to speculate because I just don't know which direction they would go. Would Boba know where Under Mandalorian are? Why didn't he try to go get the armor back from Cobb Vanth? Does it matter now that Mando has the armor to Boba Fett? Is he upset about that? So I'm curious. I'm curious to see what happens. All right. Rick and I shared some interesting emails back and forth, friend of the show. And so I wanted to share with you the email and then what we discovered, because we actually had to go back and forth to figure out what in the world happened. So this is what Rick had to say. I just listened to your podcast, and I'm so thankful for it. Your love and joy of Star Wars really helps boost my own. Thanks, Rick. I appreciate that. Whenever I hear you talk about the films, I want to go back and watch them over and over. That's like the biggest compliment that anybody could give me, man. That's awesome. I just failed to make time to do that. Well, you should. Tell you what, man, watching Star Trek Into Darkness, I really want to go watch The Rise of Skywalker now. I was like, why am I watching this when I can watch The Rise of Skywalker? One little detail in The Mandalorian has me puzzled. It concerns the child's floating egg character, the pram, if you will. I don't know the name of it right now. I think it's what it's called. You remember that Queel made one for the child in Episode 8, ends with it. But in Episode 9, the child is in his old one. I remember in the episode where the Mando rescues the child, he sees the old pram in a junk pile. However, he leaves it there, and that's why Queel made a new one. So I'm really bothered by this, that there's no explanation for the switch. One more thing you brought up in your podcast. At the end of The Marshal, you see a guy on a hill. You pointed that out as Boba Fett. I had no idea that was him. I don't remember anything about him in Return to the Jedi. I'll have to watch it again, but can you explain what happened to him? Also, he looked a lot bigger than Cobb. I say that because the armor looked too small for Cobb. So how could that small armor fit Boba Fett? Thanks for your show and all your entertainment, Rick. All right, so let's do the Boba Fett thing really quick. And I answered Rick on this in the email, but I'll do it again here. So Boba Fett in the original trilogy, we never saw his face. He was only in a couple of scenes. We learned in the prequel trilogy in Attack of the Clones were designed off of Jango Fett. Jango Fett, in return of using his DNA to make the clone army, asked for an unaltered clone to be his son. That's Boba. In the Clone Wars cartoons and in Attack of the Clones, you see that and Revenge of the Sith, you see that all the clones look like Jango Fett. Jango Fett is played by the actor Tamura Morrison. Since Boba Fett was an exact clone of Jango Fett, who was killed at the blade of the purple lightsaber of Mace Windu in Attack of the Clones, it would make sense that when Boba got older, he would look just like Tamura Morrison. At the end of Chapter 9 of The Mandalorian Season 2, we see that actor, Tamura Morrison, standing there, walking, turning away after seeing The Mandalorian going, on the desert, on the land speeder, and that's Boba Fett. So that's why he looks like Boba Fett. That's why he looks like that actor, Tamura Morrison, because that is the actor that played Jango Fett, who now is playing the older version of Boba Fett, who is a clone of Jango Fett. Now, to the pram, this was a different one to uncover, because Rick is absolutely right. He even shared a screenshot. And then I figured it out. So, in The Mandalorian Season 1, he turns in the child back to the client, and then he goes back to rescue him. When he goes back to rescue him, he finds the pram sitting in a junk pile. When he rescues the child, he just rescues him without a pram. He goes to Queel. Queel makes him a new pram. Then you get to that final episode in 9, when they bring the child to the client, the child isn't in the pram. And the pram does look different. Quill takes him back to the Razor Crest before he's killed, and the child is captured. Actually, that's episode 8. And the child is captured. Okay, so that pram gets left behind in that season 1 episode when it's empty, and he goes to take him to the client, and the client is killed by the troopers that are a part of Moff Gideon's group. So there's a third pram that has to be constructed for season 2. What's interesting, though, is the pram that they use to take the empty pram that they take to the client looks actually different than all of them. So it must just be a set piece thing. I was looking at some of the production art of the pram from season 2 and the photographs, and it looks kind of like a combination of the original pram and the one that Quill built. But again, the one that Quill built was left behind when it was taken empty to the client. So there are essentially 3. The one that got thrown away, the one that Quill built and that got left behind when the Mandalorian rescued him at the end of season 1, and then the new one, wherever the Mandalorian got it from, that the child is using in the beginning of chapter 9. There. I figured it out. And if anybody wants to add on that, anything I missed, email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com. All right, Raleigh, head curator of the Graph Archive Star Wars Digital Preservation Project, is back and has written me this. Hello again, John. You are right from a certain point of view. The question I asked you last week was this: what is the first occurrence of A New Hope in relation to the original Star Wars? I was gathering items for my digital collection for the 40th anniversary when I was reading about someone named Maurice Murphy. He was technical trumpet and actually started his 30-year career with the London Symphony Orchestra in March 5th of 1977. Coincidentally, that is the day that they started recording the soundtrack for Star Wars. Imagine that being your first day of work, a day those iconic notes were first heard as they were supposed to be heard. Anyway, I kept digging into this fascinating story when I clicked on this link that he shares with me here. They have a scan of the attendance sheet, and when I looked at it, my heart stopped. Right there at the top of the sheet, it clearly says, Star Wars, New Hope. I don't know why it's on there, and I know it may not be a huge deal to many people, but I think it's fascinating. Yeah, it is fascinating. Even before the film's release, the term New Hope was somehow attached. One more thing about how I enjoyed the franchise. When the special editions came out, and the Han shot first thing broke the news groups and forums of the day, I made a decision. To me, Star Wars is a story that is told by many people. We may never know all the details because beings see things differently. Some swear that Han shot first, and some that Greedo did. Some swear that Jabba was a fat guy that talked funny instead of a worm that got his tail stepped on, and so on. Okay, yeah, and we know the story behind that. There was a scene where Han Solo was walking next to a guy that had a big coat on, and they ended up changing that out for the special editions into the CGI character. Anyways, doing this has allowed me to enjoy the changes that annoy other fans. I can also read hundreds of fan fiction stories, watch many fan films, and actually enjoy all the stories, official and unofficial. The terms canon and legends don't matter to me because it's all Star Wars. Now, to me, the resurrected emperor was reborn in a clone and dies at the end of Dark Empire, and was also reborn in The Rise of Skywalker and dies there. I can enjoy both stories and not go nuts trying to figure out what is true. Anyways, I love the show. Keep up the good work. By the way, he says, if I start to get annoying, just let me know. May the Force be with you. No, man, I love all of this. And I asked him, too, that he drives for a living. And I said, hey, you should check out my EMBARK series. And he says he's currently, right now, walking with Roland in a world that has moved on. Once we reach the Dark Tower again, I will start your series. Thank you so much, Raleigh. And thank you, but by the way, just thank you to everybody that listens to the show and writes in. You know, to take time out of your day and write the show, that's just cool to me, that anybody would go and do that. You know, I mean, look, I host a radio show Monday through Friday on Twin Cities News Talk here, and people listen every day, and that's awesome. I mean, that's great. That's really cool. But this is equally cool. I just, to stop down and actually just write an email because I said to. I just appreciate that. Thank you very much. Raleigh, though, I dig that. And I really do think a lot of people that listen to the show and enjoy the show feel the same way, because that's how I feel. I don't get locked up into canon and what isn't canon, and this doesn't make sense and that doesn't make sense. I mean, Melinda even the other day yesterday was kind of poking into some of the things that happened in the Mandalorian chapter 10, and but she doesn't care. She's just pointing stuff out. But I thought that was really cool, a really cool take, and I feel very much the same way. And let me add something to that. I don't mind these changes in the product. I'm very much of the opinion that, the content creators, the people that create these stories, if they want to make changes, they're their stories to make changes to. I've gone through that with my EMBARK books, especially book one, well, pretty much only book one. For a lot of reasons. Book one was my first attempt to write a novel, and I'm not a good writer. And it still is. It's a long book. It's 120,000 words. It's an epic. My wife's never been an editor, but she's very well educated, reads a ton, and she edited that first book. And then I had somebody go and proofread it. But over time, I had a lot of criticism from people saying that the editing wasn't very good. And Melinda doesn't take offense to that, and I don't take offense to that. So I recently went and paid a lot of money to go and have a proper copy edit of EMBARK Book 1 done. It's available now. Before I did that, though, I went into the book and I made a bunch of changes. Nothing that changed the plot specifically, but there were just some things that I did when I first wrote it that I needed to go and fix. I wanted an element in my story. I wrote my EMBARK, the first book and the entire series, because of my love of science fiction and Star Wars. And that first book, I really wanted it to be a straightforward good versus evil morality tale with a plot that made sense, that was easy to absorb. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys, this is what the good guys are getting into, this is what the bad guys are trying to do, and this is how they can defeat the bad guys. That's what I wanted to do. But because I based it in reality, I wanted something that had kind of a Force element to it without doing the Force, right? Because I couldn't do that. Nor did I want to get too heavy-handy on the religion side of things, but I did include that. So I created this device for a reason, where good and bad, everybody sort of adheres to this idea and this belief that everything that happens in life happens for a reason. Well, I went overkill in that first book of using that term. And a lot of people have pointed that out. So I went back and drastically reduced the number of mentions that has in the story to just the pivotal moments. And I'll be complete disclosure on this, and then I'm going to get back to listener feedback here. But I'm making a larger point to what Raleigh was talking about. I think there were initially 65 references to For a Reason in the first publication of EMBARK. Now there's 10. At very specific moments. But I created this story, and I'm allowed to go back and change it to make it better. You can decide whether or not it makes it better, but for me, I made it better. And that's the way that I've always looked at these stories, and what George Lucas did with the special editions. They're his stories to tell, right? Art is subjective. All right, let's move on. Friend of the show, Disney Desi, says this: totally agree with everything you say. And this is going back to the John Boyega controversy from a couple of months ago. If anyone was sidelined, it was Ben Solo. He deserved so much more than what he got. As an Asian woman, I was disappointed that Kelly Marie Tran was also sidelined. But to say that Finn was sidelined is completely misleading and downright false. Thank you, Desi. I appreciate the email as always. Snoke's missing hairpiece said this: when Cobb said his name, I was hoping he'd say Cobb Vanth Refrigeration. Snoke's missing hairpiece, I laughed. I'm laughing about as much now as I did when I first read that comment, because that was damn funny. For those that don't get the references from The Office, if you haven't watched it, what's wrong with you? All right. J.O.B. says this. There are no filler episodes in The Mandalorian. It's all world building. All right, I'm not going to argue with you on that, right? That's fair. That's fair. All right, and then last one, Owen Dowd, friend of the show, asked this. Yep, they sell the pod in The Phantom Menace. Yeah, you know what? When I finished that episode last week, and I was talking about how cool it was that they ended up using one of the engines from Annie, little Annie, better come inside, Annie. Storm's coming. I got that line wrong, by the way. I remember that there was a line when they do sell the Phantom Menace, when they do sell the pod in the Phantom Menace. I just thought that was a rad inclusion. I hope we get a toy of that. That'd be awesome. I actually have two. I have two of those pod racers. One of them is taken apart in a box because I haven't put it out with my Star Wars collection. But the other one I still have in a box. It's one of the. I have way more items in boxes of Star Wars toys than I actually realized I had. Some of the older stuff though. I have an original Phantom Menace pod racer, Anakin's pod racer, still in the box, and then I have a Jedi Starfighter still in the box. I love that design of the Jedi Starfighter. I think I have 1, 2, 3, 4 of the original ones. I've got the one that they made, the souped-up Anakin Skywalker one that was made for the original Genndy Tartakovsky Clone Wars, and then I have an Ahsoka Tano one that was from just a handful of years ago. But I just really love that design. All right. That's it. I'm done with the show for this week. As I mentioned at the start of the show, anybody who signs up for the mailing list right now will be automatically entered in to win autographed signed copies of my EMBARK science fiction space opera series. EMBARK Book 1, Treasure in Darkness Book 2, and The Vanishing War Book 3. Still working on Gon Corbin and the Asteroid of Misfortune. Hopefully we can move to the proofreading phase of that. Cover work has begun for books 4, 5, and 6. Book 4, of which got a title change. You don't know the original title, but it has a new title now, which is a lot better. I got the first concept art back for that cover. I'm doing all 3 covers at the same time because I get a discount, even though I haven't written the books yet. But I'm hoping to release all 3 of those books next year. That's the plan. Get Gon Corbin's book out by the end of this year, and then next year, the entire new trilogy that'll make 5 stories. That'll end up being 7 stories in the EMBARK series. Hopefully, it'll be out next year. But I've started work on the covers. Oh, this cover for book 4 is, book 5 is awesome. I can't wait. Last thing, and then I'll wrap up. As I mentioned a moment ago, the final version of EMBARK Book 1, which includes the reformatting that was done a couple of months ago, and this completely new copy edit. Best version of EMBARK Book 1 and the final EMBARK Book 1 version is now available. So you can pick it up in ebook. All 3 books are available in ebook for $2.99. The paperbacks right now are priced at $11.99. They're even $11.99 or $12.99. And then, of course, the audiobook is available as well from Audible. And if you do want to purchase an audiobook, definitely pick up an ebook beforehand for $3 because you're going to get a big discount, like $5 to $10 on the audiobook by purchasing an ebook first. MyNerdWorld.net is the website. The link to Amazon is there, or you can go right to Amazon and search for EMBARK, Jon Justice, and pick up your preferred copy. And again, get yourself signed up for the newsletter by going to MyNerdWorld.net. The link should pop up the moment you get to the page to sign up for the newsletter, and you'll be automatically entered into a drawing to win signed copies of the EMBARK series. And I'm going to give away a few of those on next week's episode. All right, that's it. Have yourself a fantastic week. Be safe wherever you are, and we'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.